Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in our new webinar series from ICLEI Africa called Changing Cities, Shaping Sustainable Futures. My name is Paul Curry. I'm the manager of the Urban Systems Unit at ICLEI Africa, and it's my utter pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which is Reinventing the Smart City, an African Way. The webinar series already has a full program for the year, so we invite you to have a look in chat at that program and register for the ones that are coming up. A lot of these will be co-hosted in concert with Rise Africa, ICLEI Africa's flagship program that's bringing together thinkers, doers, and enablers to promote art, creative expression, and other ways of knowing so that we can inspire action for sustainable cities. So for the past half a year, since May, we have been doing monthly activations along different themes, and all of this is leading up to our Rise Africa Action Festival, which is now slated for the 24th to the 28th of May, 2021. And we have an open call to our colleagues and friends to submit sessions which can be part of this event, and to please submit sessions in line with our curatorial statement. And you can see that link in the chat, and the framing of Rise Africa 2021 is around new urban champions. What transformative actions are we already taking to shape sustainable, inclusive, resilient, vibrant African cities? So a note on the many spaces from which people are joining today. We are well represented by Cape Town and Johannesburg, but quite a number of people registered from Nairobi, Dakar, Douala, Casablanca, Pietermaritzburg, Paris, Grenoble, N'Djamena, Kempton Park, St. Denis, and more. And it's always great to see how the internet, a subject of our conversation today, is bringing a new kind of inclusivity of conversation across the continent and the world. So welcome, everyone. I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself in chat, and we'll take a minute or two to see what emerges, but also to reflect on how do you define a smart city? And that can inform some of our conversation moving forward. What considerations do we need for approaching smart African cities? So if I can invite you to share your name and a reflection on this, I'm gonna pause for a minute and a half to see what conceptions of smart cities we have. And you can set in the chat setting to send things to panelists and attendees so that people can respond and reflect. So from Dhaka, we have a reflection that the smart city is a green, sustainable, digitized city. Welcome, Farouk. In Bulawayo, a smart city is a highly connected, high-tech city, but we need serious innovation, but above all, political will. A smart city is one that embraces technologies in ways that do not negatively impact the city's population, because often they can. To utilize technology, data, Internet of Things to develop a sustainable and livable urban environment. From Marcel. Smartness comes in when connecting different urban systems for the benefit of the green transition. So integration. A resilient, sustainable, and made resilient through using high technology. city is a digital twin with technology that supports decision making. So thank you everyone for the inputs. Please do add further reflections throughout our discussion. Please also feel free to add questions into our question or answer box. These are findable at the bottom of your screen. And what's nice about questions is that you can see what other people are asking and people can upvote or comment on those questions. And our panelists are free to respond as we move through. So welcome everyone. We're going to introduce our speakers today. We have some colleagues who I'm really excited will present some provocations around some of the concepts of smart cities and some of the activities that are going on. We're going to start with Chukwuduguya, who's going to provide an overview of smart cities and a reflection on smart governance. She's a professional officer at ICLEI Africa. Vibke Toussaint is a PhD candidate at TU Delft, who's going to reflect on technology enablers of smart cities. So what can machine learning and the Internet of Things offer? Nonopa Tenza is going to, from Standard Bank, is going to reflect on the role of finance institutions as well as some of the concepts of smart cities and reflect on some research that they've been undertaking to understand what makes smart cities work and broaden that to the question of sustainability. We'll follow that input by from Mbali Motsaneng, who's part of the Resilient 40 Climate Activist Youth Network, who's going to reflect on how we reduce the digital divide. And finally, we'll close with Mtobisi Masinga, who is from the Green Building Council of South Africa and will reflect on integrated systems and participatory design. So I feel we were perhaps a bit bold in declaring a title saying Reinventing the Smart City, an African Way, because surely we're not going to cover the breadth of what a smart city means in this one session. And we're joining conversations which have been ongoing for quite a while and in fact have been reinventing the smart city. So I think our provocation when thinking about this webinar was that the smart city has a bit of a stigma to the term sometimes because we think of a top-down, large, holistic, technological solution which allows cities to manage everything, get a lot of data to have real-time decision-making. And in fact, a counter-narrative has been suggesting, well, how do we, from the bottom up, empower citizens through access to the internet and online services to be smart citizens and to have access to more choice in how they engage in our cities and our systems. So that's my brief overview. We hope that today provokes, and at the end, we'd like to hear your feedback about which forums fora you're engaged in on smart cities and who we could connect with to continue this conversation further. So with that, I'd like to invite our speakers to turn on their videos and we'll have a nice dialogue together. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Chukwuduguya to provide our first input.
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. As Paul has noted, I will be giving an introduction on smart cities for Africa, as well as an overview of smart governance as a key consideration for African smart cities. So when we talk about smart cities, we generally imagine cities that are technologically advanced, using ICT for efficient service delivery, fast and effective internet connectivity, and the ability to facilitate good communication. But through history of smart city developments, we have seen a shift in understanding of smart cities from technologically driven foundations to human-centric approaches. Technocentric smart cities are fueled by automation, network connections, and development by the adoption of high-end technologies, whereas the human-centric approach, on the other hand, places people at the center of development. Therefore, technology is adopted to enable growth and development that improves quality of life. Globally, cities have been transitioning and incorporating human-centric features to their smart cities. And key examples include Barcelona, where participation and citizen involvement have leveraged technology to engage with communities. And the city therefore invested in greater transparency in the field of e-governance for more accessible data. In Porto Alegre in Brazil, they achieved participatory budgeting by encouraging citizens to participate in government decision-making processes on redirecting government resources towards the poor. And in New York City, they did something similar through an open data digital platform accessible to citizens to contribute on where funding should be directed or redirected. So human-centric approaches to smart cities have been also well received in the African context, with the nudge to revision smart cities that are responsive to the African context. Organizations like the CSIR and the South African Cities Network have contributed to redefining the smart city discourse. And in the last year, we saw the CSIR produce a report that highlighted the role of inclusivity in defining a smart city. And from the South African Cities Network, on the other hand, they framed the smart city on principles that do and do not contribute to smart South African cities, emphasizing that what smart means in South Africa can and should mean what makes sense locally. Therefore, the smart city should use technology as an enabler, encourage proven low-tech solutions and the adoption of new technologies, and promote innovation. So for local governments, the City of Cape Town has taken a digital city strategy that allows the city to invest in data and data infrastructure, which are key elements for evidence-based decision-making. So while there's a shift taking place towards more human-centric and context-driven approaches to smart cities, many governments have to grapple with the impact of technology on governance processes such as service delivery. The foundational components that are usually considered when thinking of a smart city include smart governance, smart environments, smart economies, smart living, smart mobility, and smart people. And each of these components are important and have to work together to ensure a successful smart city. But many governments can also attest that the challenge from a governance perspective is decision-making around approaches to adopting smart cities in rapidly changing technological environments, in societal changes such as urban poverty and pressures from vendor-led solutions and offerings. So as showcased by the South African Cities Network's approach and response to framing smart cities for Africa, it is important in that case to develop smart cities that are based on what makes sense in the local context. And while looking at the list of key components of a smart city, one that sticks out is smart governance as a good starting point to building smart cities. Smart governance refers to the ability of local governments to make better decisions through a combination of both ICT tools and collaborative governance for the purpose of achieving developmental mandates. And again, South Africa can be used as an example in the African context of the adoption of a smart governance framing. So the Department of Cooperative Governance produced a draft conceptual framing of a smart South African cities framework early in 2020. And through their process, which is still underway, they showcase smart governance as an underpinning for their smart cities framework on major challenges facing local government, from urbanization to poverty to education and climate change. And the core elements of their conceptual framework, which seeks to coordinate intergovernmental relations activities based on planning capacity and governance, is done through systems, funding, processes, standards, as well as financing and regulation. So in conclusion, Smart governance incorporates two central considerations for Africa. The first being putting people first, which makes smart cities about achieving equitable development with technology as an enabler. And the second is that it also requires investment in data infrastructure that enables access to information for evidence-based decision-making. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chukwudu, for setting the basis for us. And I think those last two sort of provocations, putting people first and investing in data systems, not only so that we can access the world's information, but that we can start putting our information online as well, and start owning a bit of the way in which our city is understood and shared. We're going to hand over to Vibko, who's going to take us through her presentation. Thanks.
Can I make sure that you're seeing my presentation screen before I get started?
We see your presentation screen. It's within Google Slides. We can see the browser.
Yes,
visible.
I need my presenter notes. Unfortunately, that's what it is. Excellent. So yeah, my name is Vibke Toussaint. I did my BSc in Mechanical Engineering and my MSc in Computer Science at UCT in Cape Town. I spent my early career working in engineering consulting with a focus on energy efficiency and operational performance improvement, and then went on to work as a data scientist in e-commerce and academia, with my work predominantly being focused on domestic electricity research. And then in parallel to kind of let's call it the formal career activities, or my formal career path, I've also led various initiatives with the objective of skills development in the engineering sector, leadership development for technical youth, and digitization of public infrastructure, and predominantly through an organization, Engineers Without Borders South Africa, that I co-founded about a decade ago. The presentation today that I'm giving will be focused on the technical components or technical enablers of a version of smart cities. And just to kind of put a disclaimer on it, this isn't the only version of smart cities, but I aim to discuss some of the key parts that make it possible, that will make smart cities possible. So as a foundational part or starting component is that smart cities use data, so data are necessary for smart cities, but they use them to understand how citizens move through, use, and interact with the city, to understand if the city's infrastructure and services work as they're supposed to be working, and to find better ways of matching city services to citizens' behavior. So I guess in simple forms is if you have data that can do those things, no matter where that data comes from, you can start on a journey towards smart cities. And conversely, if you don't have data, then you're far away from I guess, operating in a smart environment. Because I really like what Yokudo was saying, is that data is your evidence. Data is your observations about the real world. And it's really what gives you an insight into what's happening on the ground. So some examples of what this could look like would be, for example, short and long-term risk assessments of water systems to, on a very short time scale, respond to emergency outages, on a medium time scale to improve maintenance activities, and on a long-term time scale to plan asset upgrades. Or if we want to take a completely different look, it might look at something like dynamically routing traffic systems at peak, at rush hour, to divert it away from schools. So those are kind of your, hey, this would be quite cool. But I want to illustrate it with a slightly more in-depth case study. And this case study is based in South Africa. So in South Africa, many patients that need to visit a clinic travel quite far and pay a lot of money to get to the clinics. On arrival at the clinics, the queues are long, and it frequently happens that patients need to go home without having received care. This means that they need to undertake the same costly journey again the following day. And knowing how many patients are waiting at a clinic, how long waiting times are, and thus getting an estimate for how long it will take to receive care would help patients to better schedule their visits. At the same time, clinic managers would be able to plan their operations if they can have an accurate view of the number of patient visits throughout a day and the patient throughput. So again, coming back to what we said earlier, it's understanding how people move through your city or your infrastructure and services, understanding how your services perform, and understanding how you could use your services and infrastructure to better meet the needs of people. An IoT occupancy monitoring system would now be one way of using data to address these challenges. So here again, I'm speaking what is technologically feasible. Could have cameras placed at the entrance and exit of a clinic, collecting video data, and they're using that to count people. That data is then used to provide real-time insights on clinic occupancy at any given moment in time and patient throughput over the course of the day. This information can then be provided to patients so that they can make more informed decisions on which and when they visit the clinic, so that they can avoid long queues and unsuccessful visits. And for management, occupancy data at the end of the day allows for evidence-based planning at a clinic and national level. I want to use this case study to explain a little bit how the different technological layers would work and what technological components are necessary to make it happen. So, as stated already, smart cities are about collecting and processing data. I want to introduce some concepts and the technology enablers that make an application like the one I just discussed possible. If we start at the very bottom of this diagram, we would have devices that are called tags, sensors, and actuators that collect data and execute control. They are connected locally and to the internet, which allows the devices to transmit data from the point of collection, so that would be the camera, for example, to the point of processing, which could be the cloud. And if desired, they return messages to the point of control to execute an instruction. The cloud provides data processing, analysis, and storage, which can be used by applications that serve the data. So that would, for example, that would be if you want to see it on a mobile device to see like nice graphs or statistics, and that present visualizations or APIs for decision making. Raw data flows from devices at the bottom to applications at the top. And then in applications, you'd have, if you want feedback and control, then the process data flows again from the applications back to the devices. And this 4-layer stack is, of course, then embedded in a physical environment, which means, for example, within the clinic space, and humans interface with it. And the humans can be the patients and the people directly involved in the clinic, but there are many different actors, institutions, organizations that would intersect with it. So if we look at the different technological components a little bit deeper, I want to start with the Internet of Things. Internet of Things, you can think of smartphones, smart speakers, and anything else that is smart that comes to mind. We view the Internet of Things as the extension of the digital world to the internet and the web. We view the Internet of Things can be viewed as the extension of the internet and the web to the physical world of objects. And in that sense, the Internet of Things consists of things or objects that have at least one of the following capabilities. So they can be uniquely identified, they can know their precise location, they can know the environment through they can modify the environment through remotely controlled actuation, and they can monitor them. They can obtain data about the environment. And in addition, things may have the capability of processing information. So that basically also tells you the type of data that devices in the Internet of Things can be collected. I see that I got a question. I'll read it afterwards and then respond to it. So importantly, the nature of the Internet of Things means that the IoT is a system of systems. It is a socio-technical system, which means that complex interaction of social actors, so your people and organizations and technical systems come together. And then increasingly is the IoT is becoming the Internet of Things and people. And that, of course, has some like big implications because people are not things, they don't like to be treated as things, and there are many consequences that come as a result of that. But I will leave that for discussions later in the webinar. Now moving on to machine learning. Machine learning can be viewed as statistics, that is a probabilistic view of the world, where data expresses the likelihood of something happening. then, and I think of this a little bit as the lab view. So it's like in a very pristine white lab coat environment, that's machine learning. It can also be viewed as programs though, and that is that it's algorithms with an input and an output, and they execute a piece of code. And I think of that as the machine view. So machine learning is a little bit like a machine cranking. When we use machine learning in the real world, machine learning is a designed artifact. And that leads then to a third view, which is really that machine learning in applications needs to be useful to people, because otherwise, what's the purpose of creating that artifact? If we have machine learning working in, machine learning systems then expand the boundaries of machine learning to include the infrastructure that is required to execute machine learning algorithms at scale in real time and in real life. So systems, they must consider operational aspects, training, inference, and data processing. This is just to give some language. I won't dive, it's quite technical, so I won't dive into too much detail. And finally, it then brings me to edge intelligence. Edge intelligence is machine learning systems in the Internet of Things. And this really has two important implications. The first implication is that this introduces a component view to machine learning, meaning that if machine learning is used in the Internet of Things, it should really serve the objective of the Internet of Things, which means it should serve the objectives of your application, which ultimately is the end goal that you want within your facility. For example, improving your throughput of people or improving the experience of patients. But the second implication is that machine learning has the same context, edge intelligence inherits the context of the Internet of Things. And so again, as any application, any smart application in the end is a socio-technical system that concerns things and people, and that needs to be taken into consideration. I want to quickly check how we are for time before I move into a second case study.
I think go for it.
Okay, cool. And so again, just to say is what we're doing here is we're opening the space, we're giving ourselves concepts, terms, understanding of the technology, and then throughout the webinar, there'll be a lot of space for discussing the critical questions that we want to ask around it. So the second case study that I want to look at is electricity system. So flying through it, we can, let's consider residential electricity demand. Here we've got some social actors, which are the members of a household. They've got needs, they've got desires, they've got different means. They'll have appliances that they use and own. And the appliances produce and consume electricity. So they're like, and basically like, yeah, we've got the social actors, we've got the technical subsystems. But then importantly, both of those operate in a dynamic world that is always changing. And so you'd have some aspects of that. So, okay, I guess like the external environment can have some static aspects, for example, the dwelling characteristics and the structure, but it also has dynamic characteristics like weather, light, seasons, and holidays. And so if we have, for example, a renewable electricity system where we've got our solar and our wind components being constantly changing and not static, how do we match these variable behavioral traits of people? So, one moment, let me just check. Yeah, so kind of looking at the variable electricity demand, if we have the appliances consuming and in some cases producing electricity, that determines the demand for electricity on the electric grid. And interactions between systems components can be linear. So for example, boiling a cup of electricity, boiling a cup of water means switching on the electricity, switching it off again. Can be non-linear. So for example, whether you're heating water for one person or three people. And it can be quite chaotic when, for example, people choose to make a cup of tea. And being able to use data from the electricity or various data sources to identify how we can match our electricity supply with the electricity consumption is I guess an alternative use for IoT and machine learning. I am wondering, let me just have a quick look where we are. I think, if you don't mind, Paul, I will pause here because I'm a little bit wary of becoming too technical.
And
Is that
we've
fine?
had a comment about some very technical language, but I think this has been a great insight into the elements of into the elements of smart cities. And I particularly like the sort of framing, well, understanding how people move through the system, how the system is performing, and using that information to then match city services to citizens' behavior. And I think what some of the 2 points that have come out of the chat so far, which I think we should revisit once we've had inputs from everyone, is there a risk that these data are going to just lead us to efficiency outcomes as opposed to the just outcomes that we're desiring? So how do we ensure that smart cities are delivering on the objective of inclusive systems? And I think you've remarked that they're subject to our desires and our expectations. But what I think is notable about socio-technical systems, and back to my own PhD language, is who's influencing whom. Are we influencing the technology, or is the technology pushing us into behaviors that we don't actually want in our society? So thanks, Martin and Marcel, for the comments, and I look forward to that conversation in a few minutes. We're going to hand over to Nonopa to ground us in some of the work that Standard Bank is doing, and to share what Standard Bank's perceptions of smart cities are and their role in it. Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry, Nonopa, your sound isn't coming through. Try again.
Okay. Can you hear? Okay, thanks. So as introduced, my name is Nana Patenza, and I'm a Metropolitan Municipality Specialist within the Corporate and Investment Bank at Standard Bank here in South Africa. I basically lead our strategy and our approach in terms of how we bank our clients, being the metropolitan municipalities that we look after. So our approach in terms of how we actually look after clients is to make sure that we get very close to our clients, we understand what their issues and priorities are. And obviously, we know municipalities, or in general, across the globe are contending with issues like population growth, the issues around urbanization, rapid urbanization. I mean, forecasts are telling us that by 2030, about 70% of the world's population will be residing in cities. Therefore, it means cities are needed then to come up with infrastructure to accommodate these people that are coming through. They also have to contend now with issues around climate change, responding to that, as well as some or other crises like we've seen now with the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's a lot that cities are actually juggling with. So our responsibility is just to understand that and what's their priority so that we can support them better. And then in terms of why smart cities, so that is a topic that has been quite topical in South Africa recently. We know the president has mentioned it twice in his State of the Nation addresses, and so our clients as well, it has become a priority. So we took it upon ourselves to understand what does this actually mean, and how is it going to play out in a developing country like South Africa. So our process, the process that we undertook as a bank, is what we call a customer discovery process, where we actually go out and chat to our clients to try and understand what is happening, and get their views, so that at least we can have an informed understanding as a bank in terms of what our clients are working on and what is coming their way. So what we've done is we spoke to a panel of experts across the globe, in public and private sector, across the value chain of smart cities. I mean, we touched 6 of the 7 continents. We spoke to close to 100 people that operate in this particular space, just to get an understanding. I mean, the discussions that we were having were right around the definition of smart cities and whether the challenges or pain points that we could expect when South Africa rolls out smart cities, as well as whether there will be similarities or differences between smart cities in South Africa and elsewhere in the world, and whether there will be opportunities in terms of rolling out smart cities. So it was quite interesting in that, I mean, in terms of the definition, it was, I mean, the majority of the respondents told us that actually the definition of smart cities is not, it's not new, it's not standard, and it's not necessarily about tech, which is quite a surprise, because most people, once you mention smart cities, they start thinking about flying cars and the 4IR, etc. Yeah, so that was quite a surprise for us to say tech is definitely an enabler, but it's not necessarily about tech. So that was quite interesting for us to learn. And also what we learned in terms of just the pain points and challenges in terms of actually rolling out smart cities was around skills, capacity, and education being one of the challenges that we'll probably come across as a country, in that do we have the necessary skills in terms of rolling out smart cities, as well as lack of infrastructure, because an example was actually made to say, before you can actually start thinking of having maybe a sensor on a water pipe to actually sense when there's a water leakage, you actually have to have those pipes. And those are some of the issues that we're grappling with, in that we lack the basic infrastructure, issues around funding, which is why as a bank, for instance, we involve, so that we can understand to say what are the challenges and what are the perceived challenges out there. And then also the issues are just around silos in terms of how government works and mindsets, within the cities as well as within the citizens as well, because some citizens are actually concerned to say, why are you bringing smart cities? We know, I mean, there have been issues even around 5G lately, with people burning down towers, etc. And also internally within cities, some people are worried that if you roll out a smart city, then it means it will their jobs are going to be taken over, which is the same rhetoric that we get around the fourth industrial revolution, that robots are going to take over people's jobs. So that's a mindset as well that needs to be dealt with as part of rolling out smart cities. And then in terms of differences, it was highlighted that actually smart cities are really about the needs and challenges of that particular locality. It's not going to be standard. It's not going to be a copy and paste of what's happening elsewhere in the world. They need to be responsive to the needs and challenges on the ground, as well as be responsive and sensitive to the socio-economic issues that are actually at play on the ground, and also taking into account the cultural nuances as well. So those cannot be ignored. And then in terms of opportunities, it came out quite strongly that there will definitely be economic opportunities in terms of rolling out smart cities. The sustainability opportunity as well, because that's quite key now for our cities to be able to respond to the sustainability question, and also the social benefit as well will be there. So those are some of the findings that we got. I think, I mean, maybe just in summary, what was quite interesting for us was actually the shift from smart cities to actually sustainable smart cities. Because that was quite key. That came out very strongly to say the emphasis is actually not away from tech in essence, but it's more about service delivery. It's about uplifting the residents and responding to their needs. It's about provision of basic infrastructure, as well as responding to climate change issues, as I've mentioned. And also it has to address what we call in South Africa the triple threat of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So it's definitely important that a sustainable smart city has to be responsive to the issues on the ground. And it was quite interesting because we also learned that government is actually also coming to trying to come up with a framework of smart cities in South Africa, so that you don't just have a city that's just going to put up cameras on a highway and then they say they're a smart city. But if it's not responsive to the issues on the ground, then it's not necessarily a smart city, which is what Jakutu referred to in terms of the draft framework that was issued by COGTA earlier. So those are some of the interesting insights that we've picked up. And as a bank, I mean, we are sort of going through the information that we've received so that we can understand in terms of how do we then position ourselves as a bank to support our clients in South Africa and as well in the different markets across the continent where we operate. So I'll just leave it at that for now, Paul, and then we can have a conversation at a later stage. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Noropa. I mean, I think the addition there of the reflection on some of the pains, do we have the necessary skills? How do we fund smart city approaches? Tangling with people's fears of automation. So how are we creating good opportunities for employment? And then the strand that seems to be coming through our first three inputs is that we have to be responsive and purposeful in our approach. It's not just about throwing technology into the mix, but responding to specific objectives, development objectives that we want to achieve. It brings to mind a framing from a colleague who says we need to cultivate systems of strategic intelligence. So actually deciding what types of information and data we need. Thanks. I also see a number of comments introducing yourselves. Please do introduce yourself if you haven't yet, and share your perspectives on smart cities. Really nice to see ICLEI South America joining us. So some ICLEI regional sharing. With that, I'm going to invite Mbali, my colleague from the Resilient 40, to reflect on how we can reduce the digital divide and invite more people into these online engagements and online services. I might have oversimplified that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. And I just say thank you for setting up this space. We were really talking about sustainable cities, but also taking into cognizance that we need to have different solutions. And it's nice to hear from the different experts on the platform. So as just a quick overview, in terms of my background, which is probably provided in the bio, but I've worked on public policy, international development, but as of recently in the digital inclusion space, and I work with Paul on climate activism. So in terms of my perspective, I think I just want to hone it into personal experiences as a young person who obviously wants to contribute to making an impact in our society. For me, when we talk about reducing the digital divide, it really gets onto the National Development Plan or economic development strategies of different countries to look at firstly how economies are run. How can we grow the economy? But then not only that, going into how do you utilize society's knowledge and expertise in order to enable that growth? And when you talk about the digital space or economy, for me, it's very important to touch on these few elements: digital infrastructure, digital skills, digital capabilities, because once you have the skill, how do you utilize it in order to make social or economic contributions? But not only that, look at the legislations or regulatory space. Does it allow you to become innovative as an individual, but also does it facilitate a space where there is public and private corporations in order to meet the objectives of the government in terms of social economic development, but also create a space that is conducive in order to be innovative as an entrepreneur or as small or medium enterprises. So coming on to the infrastructure space, I worked in the city of Johannesburg as a policy advisor in the mayor's office. And what was very interesting for me is that for the first time, we were thinking about, if you're thinking about internet access, as an individual, there is a lot of internet penetration in terms of residents using their mobile phones in order to access information. But how do you then get onto platforms and try and gain insights from mobile users in terms of, you know, when there is a water leakage? Residents would complain on Twitter and say, in this particular street, there has been a leakage for the past 2 weeks. Those issues get addressed, but it can sort of give you an insight as a decision maker in a government space to actually realize where are the hotspots of, you know, illegal connections, where are the hotspots where we are able to respond, you know, in the most prompt manner. How can we ensure that there is a space that we are encouraged for that civic participation? But not only that, in terms of government resolving our issues, but enabling people to actually start contributing to fixing problems that we face in governance systems. And also, I think it's very important because it also enables government or private sector to be innovative around standardizing, responses to issues that we are facing within our communities, whether be it service delivery or be it that we're trying to have new, programs that ensure that there is economic growth or development. And then you get into the policy space or regulatory space. It's very good that we've got the separation of powers between local, national, and provincial governments, but it's so important, on a national level for there to be a specific direction regarding the digital economy. In terms of the digital economy, who are the participants? At which level can they participate? Have we done a skills audit to understand, is there a curriculum for digital innovations, for smart cities? What do they mean? What does that mean for educational curriculums? Or also enabling young people to contribute towards not only upskilling themselves, but also bringing in their knowledge. So for me, it's very important that the policy and regulatory space is not only open to creating a conducive environment, but then we're able to tap into different skills and ideas or tailor-made solutions on how we can actually contribute as young people or also members of the society, different demographics that are involved. And then also I wanted to touch on access. Access for me is that, fine, I have my technological device. We also need to map out which are the spaces where we can create consolidated hubs. So if you don't have access to a computer or mobile phone in a marginalized area, are there specific centers that are actually geo-mapped so that people know if they want information on a specific opportunity, or they want to learn about cybersecurity skills, where are the places that they can go to that are accessible to them? And then go beyond and understand that as much as you've got access as an individual member of society or as part of an institution, think about how do people make decisions online? Because I may have access to an internet center or community library, but do I know that I can get job opportunities? Do I know that there is free online learning platforms? And this is particularly very important because with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that education has to be sustainable. We can't expect young people or, professionals or, people that are coming back into the educational system to depend on face-to-face. UNISA was well placed, for example, to get into the space of, oh, it's COVID-19, we're already teaching online. But also people need to know that there are other opportunities of free education online, but also how to make those decisions that impact their lives on a different space. And then, coming back to also infrastructure. Infrastructure, when you think about the internet or sustainable cities, you're thinking, I have to have access to Wi-Fi. There's different innovative models, like the most recent one that I've learned about is something called TV white spaces. What is TV white spaces in terms of internet access? What is spectrum allocation that governments keep speaking about? We need to be able to really speak about those things, because when we're not teaching people the terms or terminologies regarding digital innovations or digital divide, we keep excluding people out of this information society that we're creating. So for me, it's very fundamental that we go beyond the infrastructure, but then we start going into the basics of getting a skills audit of what do people know and which level do we want to get them in? How do we include them? How are we all speaking the same language so that we can create solutions, but also leverage each other's expertise, experiences, knowledge base, connections in order to facilitate either smart cities. And in terms of just closing for me, related to sustainability, climate change, and cities, when I was in the local government space, what I realized is that local governance works when there is participatory platforms. And so I think there needs to be more investment into that space. I think in terms of not only complaining to government and saying you're not delivering, but also creating a space where it's a forum of exchanging different ideas, but also it's a forum where, local governments can actually be more innovative around how it collects different revenue, how it expands its revenue streams, but also how it shows citizens that this is an opportunity for you to make your city better. So get that buy-in. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks so much, Mbali. I think there your point on infrastructure, skills development, bringing people into the information society, I think is really important, and refers back to, are we leaving people behind if we follow a smart city approach blindly. And then, how do we cultivate local government officers who, have the interest and desire to engage in participatory processes, which honestly, and we know, and participants will know, they can be spaces of conflict, and people are often afraid to share information because people might misinterpret or draw their own conclusions or things like that. So equipping our local governments to be able to do to engage in participatory process, I think, is really, really powerful, important. I see some people have the desire to ask questions. Please ask some questions into the comments. We have one more panelist, and then we'll have a further discussion on some of the ideas that have emerged. So thanks very much, Mbali. Can I invite Ntobisi to share some reflections vibing off that theme on participatory design and integrated systems?
Sure. Thank you for that, Paul, and thank you to Mbali for really a nice, thought-provoking conversation and some sentiments. In fact, I'd like to thank all the panelists, because I think everything that was mentioned here resonates with me, and I'd like to pour some sentiments. So mine is not more of a presentation. It stems from thought, and then I'll touch a bit on smart cities, and then I'll go back again to reflection and touch on some thought-provoking work that has stemmed out of two scholars that I really think they're doing groundbreaking work, because after all, we are trying to reinvent the African city. So I am trying to answer that title that you talked about, Paul. So I do not want to give you futuristic, Eurocentric, knowledge-based solutions. No, I want to give you the true African indigenous knowledge systems approach to what really is a smart city. But just to start us off from my head, the term smart city is as complicated as the term sustainability, because everybody has an idea of what a smart city is, or everybody thinks or assumes what sustainability is. And it can be localized individually and implemented through various sectors, and how we all define what the term really means. But my thinking and my insights, especially just for today's conversation, is around the smart cities need to, perhaps, if we're talking about smart cities, we're talking about cities that are relooking their thinking, right? They are relooking their decision making, they're relooking at their planning process, they're looking at their operations, relooking their democracy, their state of democracy, the way they practice their democracy. They're re-looking at their power dynamics, and they're re-looking at how they give the voice to the voiceless. So these are part of the elements that I think when we are re-looking at a smart city, because every other principle that has been mentioned is a principle that it has been introduced by Europe, and we are all just taking it, we're throwing it here. IoT, Information of Things, 4IR, Fourth Industrial Revolution, which I have many issues with, 5G technology, and so on and so forth. However, leave that aside. So that's the radical part of me. I leave those aside. But then I come back to the mainstream again. And then I say, smart cities are human-centered. So I'll go back to our first panelist, and I agree. Smart cities are human-centered. These are carless cities for me. We're seeing the approaches happening globally of how so many cities are now going with the human approach of limiting cars in the city. It is helping us. It is helping us in meeting our net zero carbon emissions targets of 2030 and 2050, and reducing the adverse effects of climate change, which a smart city in principle should be aiming to. A smart city follows climate change and adheres to climate change. So we're looking at a city that attributes to that. We're looking at a city that talks to pedestrianization. We're looking at a city that talks to non-motorized transport. How effective and how effective is our transport systems? Are they integrated, and how are they integrated, and to what degree? So we're looking at a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. And for me, there is nothing that makes me cringe like the term public participation. I've worked in national government and local government, and I can tell you right now, most of what that is just a checklist. It's just to tick. They had a time and a chance to just say what they wanted to say. But are we really going to consider it? Highly unlikely. And that is the truth. You don't really matter when you're on the ground. The decision maker is the person that sits at the top and puts a stamp and signs off and gets the votes. That is the real decision maker. You at the bottom are there for face. It's just an activity. So we can argue till tomorrow there is no such thing as public participation. Then we move further, right? So we look at a design that incorporates the human scale. Now, furthermore, into the human scale, we were talking about neighborhoods, which we have very, very, very few in South Africa and pretty much in our region of Africa. How many of our cities are designed to cater for people on the ground? And I'm talking about the pro-poor, the people on the ground. How many of our cities have integrated transport? How many of our people on the ground are spending more than half their wages on transport going to work? So how are cities talking to this? Because for me, I'm sorry, most of our cities are still perpetuating apartheid planning. And we have these new world policies, but we are still doing the exact same thing. There are no new solutions. You know, everything is pretty much the same under the sun. Furthermore, we need to be constructing these human-centered cities in a human and animal approach. You know, so we need to relook at how we are building our cities. What types of building materials are we using? If we're still using bricks and mortar, then we are pretty much moving back into the Stone Age era, because we need to be moving towards timber in construction, mass timber in our construction, because these are materials that talk to the environment, they talk to fauna and flora and the animals, and they're much better for breathing quality. They emit less carbons, as we all should know, or I should highlight, is that buildings globally emit about 40% of the global emissions globally. So buildings alone, in all the developments that we look at, we are contributing a lot of emissions, and we have a big role to play as academic professionals, as technocrats, as bureaucrats, and as civil society organizations. And furthermore to that, we've heard earlier on today that about in every 10 people will live in urban areas by the year 2030. Which is why when you look at commitments, what the C40 cities is doing, and it's great that 4 of our metros in South Africa have joined the seat at the table, whereby they've taken a commitment to say that all new buildings by 2030 are going to be net zero carbon, and all existing buildings by 2050. And this is another attempt to try and reduce these carbon emissions. I think the transition to sustainable smart cities depends on social, cultural, economic, and climatic factors. The response to climate change must be forefront, the smart carrying capacity of cities, because these populations, due to urbanization, are going to have a heavy load on infrastructure, and densifying cities is not going to be the answer. Neither will sprawl be the answer. So we actually don't have an answer to how are we going to answer to these issues. And I think the 3 key pillars here is that the presence of high-ranking officials with responsibility, access to much more data collection that allows cities to better understand the implications of design on well-being, and better visualization techniques to enrich the community and feedback. And this, furthermore, I want to highlight some of the work that some of the cities are actually doing in the C40 Cities program. Some of them have developed green building policies. They're working towards carbon tax incentives, and which is something we should be working towards. We need to serve the environment. We need to have these approaches that we have, whereby it's a polluter pays principle. And for those that are actually doing the work, they get the carrot as the reward rather than the stick as the reward. We have green bonds that are available that are talking to some of these initiatives. And then just to close off, because I've been everywhere, I'm now bringing back the radical side of me again. And I'll now take some notes off a piece that was written by 2 scholars that I really liked the work that they were doing. And so I'll just read a page or 2 here quickly. So this is called Redesigning the Modern World, a Decolonial View from Epistemologies of the South by Dr. Eric Nyembezi and Professor Sabelo Gajen. So this is Reworlding from the Global South, and they propose 10 decolonial logics that can contribute to redesigning of the world. So its reconstituting logics are de-anthropocentrism, de-imperialization, de-sectoralization, de-patriarchalization, deracialization, debourgeoisement, decorporatization, democratization, decanonization, and deborderization. But I'm not going to talk to all of them. I'll just touch on 4 of these. So de-anthropocentrism, this involves the removal of the human as the center and the master of all species on the planet, and reimagining of a post-human world defined by mutual and reciprocal relationships between human and non-human bodies. As the human/non-human line is dismantled, the logics of coloniality, of nature and power will dissipate, making way for the imagining of mutual economic relations between mankind and the natural environment. And more than ever right now, if we're talking about climate change, it is important that we have a nature-based design, a human-centered approach, and to talk to some of the issues and some of the adverse effects that have already started happening and will happen if we don't act. If we all saw the climate clock that was displayed in New York that said we had 7 years and 312 days to act, which was this time last year, we now have 6 years and 311 days to act up until the adverse effects of climate change start knocking on our doorsteps. The next one I'd like to talk to is de-imperialization of global designs and relations. This refers to the...
If you can round in about a minute, that would be great.
Sure. So this talks to, refers to the decolonization of asymmetrical power relations through decentric, Eurocentric modernity. The next one is desecularization of spiritualities of the world. This refers to the recentering of all spiritualities that enabled human and non-human to coexist harmoniously. And then the other one is depatriarchization, which talks to of the gender design. This involves dismantling patriarchy and toxic masculinity and the treatment of women as lesser people in societies, organizations, and our institutions. And I think to round it up, we need to be talking about democratization of the world, the present and asymmetrical pyramidal structure of the global power with a sole superpower supported by accumulation of weapons of mass destruction is inimical to democracy. Lastly, my last point, last 2 sentences, decanonization of epistemic designs. This refers to decentering of Eurocentric knowledge that for centuries had canonized itself as a universally applicable knowledge. Therefore, it is meant to bring a fold of all knowledges that were pushed to the margins. So if we also look, we all have the answers here. One simple example before I go is that if we look at the African hut design, it is still rendered as the most thermal regulatory piece of architecture globally. No matter how hot it can get, you step into an African hut, the temperatures immediately drop. So the answers have always been there. The answers lie in indigenous knowledge systems. We just need to relook at the answers, step back a bit and find the answers there. We've had civilizations like the Great Mali City, the Benin City, the Motapa Empire, Timbuktu. So we do have all the answers, but obviously we need to address them with the new world problems that we have today. Thank you.
Thanks, Subisi. That's a whirlwind of concepts which I think you bring together, and I think what that sort of suggests to me is you can't talk about a smart city in isolation from other concepts. So thanks for sharing the tenets of decolonization. I mean, I think there are lots of systems that we need to disentangle ourselves from, and I think my sense from across the board with panelists is embedding sustainability and social justice into a smart city framework is one route. But I quite like what Kirsten Wilkins has added into the chat now, which is a critique smart cities might be a shiny distraction threatening to replace the difficult conversations that we struggle to have about centering justice and in spatiality. So there's another provocation, perhaps. Do we need to reclaim smart cities as a concept? Or do we not want to necessarily participate in that discourse? So I see a lot of really great inputs in chat. I'd like to welcome panelists to all turn on your videos and we could start, I think, with some of the early inputs, maybe a clarification point that was voiced by Marcel on Vibke, your case of the hospital. And then while you're reflecting on that, Vibke, if you could also then reflect on Martin's provocation about, are we being led by the nose, perhaps by smart cities towards efficiency? How do we be purposeful about that?
Thanks so much. And thanks to the other speakers also for providing such interesting and insightful perspectives. I've been quite humbled and quite engrossed in listening to you all. So maybe I'll put my personal stance out first, and that is that I think both smart cities and industrial revolution are things that should follow in the future. I don't think in terms of Africa's development that they are immediate concern. I think in that sense, it's like smart cities as a concept to me are a technology first, bring a technology first perspective. Industry 4.0 assumes that you've got industry 1, 2, 3 sorted out, that you've got electricity, that you've got water, and so on. And so from a personal perspective, I need to put that out there. I guess from a view of the presentation, it was me trying to say, this is from some of the technologies that are positioned as being revolutionary in the space. This is what, I guess, this is maybe a way of understanding it. And so the healthcare case, for example, was an illustrative case study rather than a suggestion of saying this is the way that we should go. And it's maybe also trying to fill the gap between saying what do we want the smart cities concept to mean for us versus what are other ways in which it's currently positioned. So I think maybe my presentation was more on this is how smart cities are currently positioned from a European or an Asian perspective. So from that perspective, I definitely don't want to defend. I don't want to defend a technological solution that puts occupancy monitoring systems into healthcare facilities as the way to go. And I think Nonopa said it quite nicely, is that if we put a facade of cameras along a highway and pretend that that's a smart city, it's pretense. And so at the end of the day, so for one is that, I mean, even if we go down to the concept of countries, cities, economies, they're made up of people. So without people, we don't have any of those. And smart cities, so I would say, is like the foundation is always people. And then the second layer becomes one of infrastructure. So saying again, it's like there's no point in making smart cities smart if there's no infrastructure that is providing services. So that would be not a direct response, but maybe a clarification and trying to contextualize a very technical presentation that speaks about machine learning and Internet of Things within a conversation about kind of, I guess, owning what smart cities might mean or do mean in an African context.
Thanks so much. I'm trying and perhaps failing a little bit to keep my eyes on chat because there's certain things coming in there. I think to request from Nonopa, we had a question about reflecting on your notion of automation so that it results in job losses. And I wonder if there have been things emerging in your explorations which reflect on how we ensure participation and employment as we roll out a smart city approach or a sustainable smart city approach.
Thanks for that question. I think, what will be important is that obviously as we move towards smart cities, there are industries, skills that are not going to be required anymore, but then there are new industries and skills that are going to be created. So the issue of upskilling becomes quite critical in terms of making sure that we upskill people so that they are able then to take advantage of the opportunities that are coming up. And even our education and the curriculums that we have out there, they should actually be geared for the future that we are moving towards as part of the whole sort of journey of moving forward towards smart cities and being more connected and also just embracing the fourth industrial revolution. So I think that's something that came up quite strongly to say the issue of skills, obviously, yes, going to the future, skills are a big thing, but then we need to also have proper plans in place to make sure that we address that whilst taking everybody along on this particular journey.
Thanks so much. And I think that comes back to the reflection on naysayers saying, well, we're going to lose all our current jobs, and there's a sort of notion that, well, we don't quite know what jobs we're going to be needing in the future as well, and we haven't arrived in that space of certainty about that. And I think, Tobisi, this is very prevalent in your remarks about we don't know what to do. Do we densify? Do we allow sprawl? And in that way, you're occupying a sense of uncertainty there. So how do we hold that uncertainty while making some points, making some decisions, or how do we move through that city, given that we are trying to actively pursue just and inclusive livelihoods?
Sure. I really think with that, is it a conundrum or a mammoth task that we find ourselves with or sitting in, being it's either or of the two? When we look at the holistic approach of smart cities, for me, it first starts with smart people. It honestly does. And I mentioned in my comments earlier that smart starts with smart people or smart citizenry, and we were talking not just level of education of people, but it's the flexibility to get one or more opportunities for people, the knowledge about what happens in your cities, the policies, the schemes, what launches your government is doing. And it also stems from a smart economy. What sort of indicators, like, for example, entrepreneurship, self-employment, what's the GDP per person or GDP per person per capita, flexibility of our labor markets. We're now at a stage whereby the whole globe is facing this pandemic called COVID. And so what does a climate change resilience strategy or action plan look like for all of our cities as we sit throughout Africa and the world? So if we're looking at all those strategies, how do we then now link them to sector jobs resilience plans? Because for me, if you're tying up a climate change strategy, which is addressing the issues of the world now, we're now tying it to sector jobs resilience plans, which is looking at how COVID is fighting with us, and now the changes of climate change, people are losing jobs. What are these resilience jobs of the future looking like? Are they more green jobs? So in light of also talking about green jobs, what model of the circular economy are we adopting to these circular resilience jobs? So everything works in tandem, and we need all of this together through smart governance, smart mobility, smart environments, and definitely smart living, because we need to have developments and buildings of the future that are energy efficient, that are resource efficient. We can't have buildings that are wasting resources that are non-renewable, water, electricity, waste. We can't still be having landfill sites when we're fighting COVID and climate change today and still call ourselves smart cities. For me, that is a bit of backward development there.
Thanks so much. Another question in chat was framed to Drakuru about smart governance, and a question of, can we distinguish between e-governance, which is framed the automation of municipal services such as online payments, emailing bills instead of posting. How do those pieces get distinguished from smart governance as a wider process?
Thank you, Paul. I certainly agree with the response that was put into the chat by Kirsten, where she basically explains a process of the value of a e-governance approach. And e-governance is definitely about automation, but it goes back to what I presented on, which was when you take on, for example, a smart governance approach, or as Ntobisi mentioned, when you take on a smart people approach, you essentially put to question the reason why you're taking on an automation process. Why do you need e-governance? You're using it essentially to respond to a challenge. What value does automating a process give to a municipality? Does it allow you to achieve certain objectives? Does it allow you to achieve certain mandates? Does it allow a city to improve service delivery or to improve quality of life for citizens?
Thanks, Rikudu. Mbali, Mtobisi basically ripped apart public participation. And, you know, the parts of me which agree that sometimes we say it's participation when in fact it's consultation. What are your perceptions about how we can actively create more participatory processes? What are the practical steps?
Great. It's a great question. Thank you for that. So for me, consultation, maybe to start there first, is that, for example, in local government, you would set up, you'd write up a policy or a strategy, and you would engage your local ward councillors to go into the community and ask, what are your needs? Do these policies reflect the policy programs that we want to implement? And that is a process of governance, right? Because you are serving a specific constituency and you want to make sure that your plans are reflecting their needs, but also that budget is allocated to those specific programs, because, I mean, that's the way that governance works. We're working together. In terms of participatory governance, I think creating a platform, be it virtual or actually be it in person, whereby the objectives or specifications of a discussion point, such as sustainable cities, is actually from ground up. So understanding what are the pertinent issues that are faced by local residents, be it water, electrification, housing, what are the specific issues that affect them on a daily basis? It's more like design thinking. Design thinking is about going into a community, asking for the ideas of how do we solve certain solutions, and making your policy programs more user-centric. So for me, it's getting to a space where you're asking the user what is relevant for you and how do you respond to it? And in your response, identifying that, of course, local government is there to provide services to the residents. However, it does not have the entire value stack of expertise or capabilities or networks. So therefore, it becomes a shared responsibility whereby experts within the residents' communities can say, hey, I actually have a specific interest in ensuring that our parks are clean. Therefore, I will volunteer because I've got this innovative tool in order to monitor these systems. So it's really more of using public-private partnerships in order to facilitate service delivery, fast track priority programs or issues of a specific community, and not seeing it as a sole responsibility of governments. Of course, public funds come from residents, but also we should also be empowered to make decisions and also to create those forums whereby we are participating in creating solutions and also in implementing services.
We had a session on water governance yesterday, where we sort of painted a lot of individual responsibilities towards a resource, but we hadn't included responsibilities to participate in governance systems to actually shape the system. So I think that's an interesting link. I'd like to do a round of closing reflections, and just a note came in from Martin Price. If we're serious about decolonization, perhaps we shouldn't be talking about smart people in technology first terms. And I think this tension exists, and I don't know if we will arrive at a consensus. Do we use technology to achieve social outcomes? Do we start with people and, to the provocation of decolonization, acknowledge multiple ways of knowing as valid, and therefore smart people isn't about smart from a Eurocentric Northern perspective that can have many different ways of knowing. But I think in closing, there were two interesting provocations, and I know Vipka responded to one in chat. Most cities don't have access to data or even basic indices to measure development, and that's a challenge for most. So how can cities with no unusable data start the transition to becoming a smart city? So I'll offer that could be an option to respond in closing. What is the starting point for a smart city? And then another question was, what about Lagos, a city of 20 million people? What is the starting point, or can a smart city support a city like that. And our local governments, I'm interpreting the right deliverers of that there. So we'll go around and you can choose which to respond, about a minute or so each. Jakuru?
No problem, I can go first. For me, I think the starting point is definitely technology and investing in collecting the data, investing in data infrastructure, processes such as developing open data platforms and systems that allow you to make sure that data is accessible to everyone and anyone and is available for the purposes of evidence-based decision-making. When you have data, you're able to have a reference point for what needs to be done and where the challenges are and what needs to be responded to. Again, data it's the foundation for a lot of decision-making processes. It helps cities to know what exactly they need to respond to. When decisions are made, you're able to go back and say, this is what informed my decision-making process, and this is why I made a certain decision. Essentially, data gives you the information you need to facilitate development.
Thanks so much. And Vipka?
Yeah, you've taken the words out of my mouth. But I want to echo what Yakudu is saying, is that ultimately it might be worthwhile replacing the word data with the word evidence gathering, and saying whatever you can take to give you evidence of how people are experiencing life on the ground and how the services that you're delivering as government is meeting those needs of the people, that is data. If it's paper based, it's okay. If you can find people that are willing to gather the data, that's okay. If you're going to use sensors because you don't have the people or because the places are inaccessible, it might be too cold, it might be too high up, you can use sensors, that's okay. But really moving to this narrative of saying, how do we observe what's happening in the world to the people that we are wanting to serve? How do we gather evidence about that? And how do we collect, manage, analyze, process that? And then as a closing provocation, I want to put a provocation out there and say, maybe for Africa, we shouldn't look north so much, and we shouldn't use north as a reaction. So in that sense, I mean, because Europe is pretty old and outdated, I think the things are happening east. And that's not to say that we should develop like Asia, but I think Europe is far away from realizing smart city concepts. I think Asia is much closer towards that. And of course, I don't think we want to go down that route either. But I think we need to expand our narrative to not only use Europe as the reference point we're reacting against. I think we need to start moving much more to look at the East, especially the East also.
Interesting to reframe our reference point. Nonopa?
Thanks, Paul. I think for me, I mean, the starting point is really to ensure that we have regulation in place, as well as an enabling environment that will ensure that any smart city plans that we have as a country and countries across the continent do not actually perpetuate the current inequalities that we currently see at play, as well as even the issues of unemployment. I mean, that concern is quite very legitimate, in that we currently have high unemployment rates, and then if we're talking about plans that might even further that, then it becomes a problem. So, I mean, as part of the work that we did, we also spoke to about 2,500 young people across South Africa. And the major thing that they actually spoke about in terms of their expectation of a functioning city is around job opportunities, which is quite interesting, because everybody always expects that young people are going to talk about Wi-Fi and data, etc. But for them, they were saying a functioning city should be able to open up job opportunities for me, followed by then a functioning city, etc., in terms of safety, etc. So I think for me, that would be a starting point. And also, I mean, I want to agree in terms of the closing remarks that were just made now in terms of reframing our viewpoint from what is called the global north. In that, for instance, I mean, there are issues around maturity levels that are at play when you're rolling out smart cities, in that obviously the global north has maturity levels that are far different from where we are, even just around issues just around connectivity and data and infrastructure provision, etc., etc. So it's important that we do not frame our thinking and how we do our planning based on that. But it actually gives us a vantage point as African cities to learn what, or to see and observe what has actually worked and has not worked there, so that whatever plans that we then have and plan to roll out, we also then eliminate all those issues that have been experienced elsewhere. And I mean, just the questions that are sometimes asked is to say, do we actually retrofit cities that are currently in existence, or do we go out and start new cities from scratch, which is what, for instance, South Africa is touting when we mentioned the Lanseria Smart City. So those are some of the debates that are out there, and we can always learn from other areas to say what actually worked better, because some people are saying there are going to be challenges if you're trying to retrofit current existing infrastructure or cities, etc., etc. So it's quite important just to use that vantage point that we have as African cities to say what has worked elsewhere, what can we adopt, what can we then reject and move away from. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Yeah, not refusing to look at what mature technologies exist and where we can learn. Thanks. Mbali?
Thank you for that. I actually just want to latch on Nanopa's comment about retrofitting. I think it's so important because context matters. If we're talking about smart cities, climate change, sustainable cities, I think it's important to understand our context as Africans, you know, or understanding what language do we use for digital. What does smart cities mean? We need to be able to contextualize it. We need to educate people. We need to meet them where they are. As much as we have a vision of where we want our country to go, respective countries to go, but I think it's important that we make it contextual to where we're at, because once we miss the gap of where we're at, we're shooting for other people's goals. You know, we're not actually aiming to have an inclusive society, but rather we're catering for people that are on the upper echelons of understanding digital skills, 4IR. All these concepts can be so divisive in a way, you know, because if you want to be inclusive, you need to meet people where they are, and you need to sort of create a system where we're leveling up. You know, we need to make those audits. Where are people in Kailicha at? Where are the people in Cape Town at in terms of smart cities? And then you create an inclusive strategy towards achieving your goals.
Thanks so much. Meet people where they are. Ntobisi?
Sure. I think my points, just to close up, are probably going to be very minimal. When I looked at the comments that came through regarding, sorry, I just want to scroll up and see it. So if we are serious about decolonization, perhaps we shouldn't be talking about smart people and technology first terms. So if I'm understanding what that comment meant, decolonization doesn't necessarily mean delinking from technology. And for me personally, technology is not what we deem it to be. When you talk technology, the best technological device we ever had is our human brain. And that's where technology starts from for me. So that's the biggest device. And when we talk infrastructure, if we're talking smart infrastructure, we're talking of the human body, the physical human body. That is probably the best infrastructure that we have. So those two combined work in tandem. And having said that, if I then now move towards smart people again, I'm talking about how the people act and how the people relate. So it goes to as far as something as little as, if you are throwing a paper on the ground, you know, call a spade a spade. I don't believe you perhaps acting as a smart person, because you're not thinking of the other person, neither are you thinking for the environment around you. So it's small human actions, doesn't necessarily talk to the bigger picture of, obviously, when I was talking about smart people at first, I was talking about level of qualification. I was talking about flexibility of getting more opportunities. I was talking about public participation. I was talking about how people are involved in their knowledge of policies and schemes around their cities. And obviously that relates to public participation and how are they in tune with their city in terms of what is happening in and around them. And now there was also a question around that how can cities...
20 seconds, please.
20 seconds, sure. How can cities with no unusable data start their transition? I think it is simple as the answer lies with every individual city. For example, in Johannesburg, I mentioned earlier that we have trolley pullers, well, they're not called that, but they pull trolleys and they take waste into waste centers, and then they recycle. And this was something that nobody employed them, but they took it upon their own. And that is a beautiful model of the informal economy, of where people are smart people and they're taking decisions on the ground by themselves as a process of self-actualization, and they're empowering themselves, and it's actually putting food on the table at the end of the day.
Thanks. And I think that's the ingenuity that we are looking for when we look at African cities into the future, is how do we support those who are developing their own initiative to respond to the challenges that we're seeing. I want to extend a great vote of thanks to our speakers. I think this has been a really compelling discussion, and also to those who participated and put questions and ideas into chat. Please, I look forward to seeing you in future engagements. Please do consider submitting a session proposal to our open call for Rise Africa, which will take place in May. I think there are some really great thinkers, doers, and enablers in this room who can add value to our discussions there. As a reminder, this is part of our Changing Cities webinar series for this year, and the next one is going to be in a month on Water Innovation Showcase, Valuing Water, which is the UN Water theme for 2021. And we are putting together a showcase of really interesting work with the Water Research Commission that's reflecting on how we value water and how we can drive water sensitive cities and good water outcomes for our citizens. Thanks so much for joining us, and please do stay in touch.